Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Signum Symposium, all about the Spring 2020 courses at Signum University. My name is Gabriel Schenk, and I'm a preceptor and lecturer at Signum University, and I'm not teaching any of the courses this term, but luckily I'm joined with a panel of experts and teachers who are teaching these courses or have put the courses together in advance. The image you see on your screens is a photograph from my garden this morning. I took a photograph of my snowdrops that have just blossomed because I thought it was a very encouraging thought that we were about to enter into the spring term at Signum University, even though it is still very cold and dark for many of us, and we have many more weeks of winter left. But we are looking forward ahead to the longer days and the warmer temperatures, as well as all the courses on offer at Signum this term. The point of this event is twofold. One is to help people who are still deciding on which courses to sign up for, whether you are a credit-taking student or a auditor. You should get a move on and register if you haven't done so already, because classes actually start from tomorrow onwards. But you technically have a bit of time, but don't dilly-dally is my advice, because preceptor sessions will start this week. But you may still be umming and ahhing, and hopefully this session will help, because we're going to be going through all the different courses, and this is your opportunity to ask any questions you have about the classes. But the second reason for holding this event is because one of the few things we miss out on in an online university is hearing the end of previous lectures as we're waiting outside the lecture hall, hearing the students come out of the room and discuss what they've just been learning. There's much less of a sense of things going on around you when you're at an online university and you have to focus on just the course you're doing. So it's easy to forget that there are other courses running concurrently. And so it's nice to have this moment where we just sort of look around us and think about the other courses running, even if we're not registered or signed up for them. So that's the point of the event. As always, do ask questions. This is your space, your time to ask any questions you like about anything at all to our illustrious panel, not just limited to questions about the courses, although that is obviously the topic under discussion as well. So I'll just very briefly describe the four courses, and then I'll introduce our panel. The first course on offer this term is Lewis and Tolkien, about the authors C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. Then we have a new course called Classical Myths and Legends. Then we have a course called Modern Fantasy 2. And then we have the course Intro to Germanic Philology 2. So those last two courses are continuations of the previous term's courses. But let me introduce our panel. So firstly, we have Liam Daly, who has been teaching at courses in medieval literature, mythology, and modern fantasy literature at Signum University since its first semester in the fall of 2011. So he's a real veteran. A PhD candidate at the University of Maryland with a focus in medieval and Renaissance literature. Liam is currently completing his dissertation on the medieval origins of the early modern history play. He is excited to be teaching Lewis and Tolkien this semester, making it the third time he has taught this course and the 20th time he's taught for Signum. So fantastic to have you with us, Liam. And that's incredible. Yeah, that's a 20th classes. That's 20 classes. That's great. We also have Corey Olson, who is the president of Signum University. He teaches regularly at the Mythgard Institute, where he is currently giving a free weekly course on C.S. Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet. He hosts the Exploring the Lord of the Rings series and co-hosts the Silmarillion Film Project series on YouTube and other platforms. His critical analysis, Exploring J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, was published in 2012. Other recent publications include the chapter on poetry in A Companion to J.R.R. Tolkien, edited by Stuart Lee, and the chapter on Lancelot and Guinevere in Mallory and Christianity. So great to have you with us as well, Corey. Next, did you want to say something, Corey? I cut you off.
Oh, yeah, no. Good to be here.
Good to have you too. Next, we have Larry Swain, who earned his MA in Medieval Studies at the Medieval Institute at Western Michigan University and his PhD at the University of Illinois. He co-edits the journal The Heroic Age, a journal of early medieval Northwestern Europe, and has worked on the Old English newsletter and writes about archaeology for the year's work in Old English Studies. Larry is teaching the new course on classical myths and legends. We also have Sparrow Alden, who is an adjunct professor of English at the River Valley Community College, where she is program director at Writerspace. At Signum, she is precepting professor, Hestia of the Hearth, and advisor. She is the author of the Morning Meanders series of poetry books, available on Amazon, capturing thoughts on spirituality, life, and existence in raw poetic form. So wonderful to have you with us as well, Sparrow.
Thank you very much.
So, and we already have some questions and comments coming in. Noam says, well, what is the meaning of life? Does anyone want to answer that? We thought we'd start off easy.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, if there was a science fiction course, we might say the answer is 42. But maybe we'll come back to that one, actually, unless anyone has any quick thoughts. And Takaka says, a shame I can only take a course one course at a time for my sleep and sanity. Yes, well, that is true. You're not limited to just taking one course for any technical reason, but of course, you know, there's only so many hours in the day. But it's still nice to hear what other courses are going. So I think we'll just start with looking at Lewis and Tolkien, since it's the first on the list of our courses. And now I understand that the lectures were all recorded and taught by you, Corey, and then Liam, you're going to be precepting this. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Fantastic. So Liam, if we start with you, you mentioned I mentioned in your introduction that this was the 20th class you've taught, and this is the third time you're teaching this course. So I'm just curious, what was different the second time round? What do you think might be different this time round? Is it always the same, or are they different every time you teach these courses?
Oh, I mean, the short answer is yes, they're different every time we teach them. I mean, it's going to be the same books and materials as in previous iterations of the course, but I feel like the thing about teaching the course more than once is that there's a sort of a snowballing effect with the information that you get when you're teaching this course. So, you know, going into it, the first time I taught it, you know, I know this much about it. The sort of collective body of information that you accumulate as students in the class, people add to it. It gets bigger and bigger every time you teach the class. So I'll be teaching information, you know, from the first time I taught it. We're now incorporating information from the second time I taught it, and this time it's going to be like the third, you know, most complete set of information that we've had yet, basically.
Fantastic. And I suppose you're right. It's a huge topic, because this course could have just been C.S. Lewis, and it would have been a huge topic. Yes. It could have just been Tolkien. It's a huge topic, but it's both of them together in 3 months. So fantastic. Great that you're teaching it again. And Chicago comments, I was there, I mean, in the first course as an auditor. So that was presumably that was the first time you taught that course, Liam. So that would have been, what, 4 years ago, something like that?
No, longer than last time I taught this course was in 2014.
Yeah, 8 years ago, actually.
Wow, 8 years. Because it was my first class.
Yes.
Fantastic. Yes. So Sparrow, were you also in this class as a student?
Yes.
Fantastic. And how was it?
Oh, wow.
It's a good course?
My mind was taken out of the ordinary world and expanded, and it was so exciting because Corey and Liam just said, okay, kid, here's the bar. No, let's put it there. And it was wonderful.
Fantastic. I suppose the one advantage of Lewis and Tolkien studying them is that they're both passed away, so there's not going to be any kind of huge new. They're not going to suddenly come out with a new thing. Although of course with Tolkien they do keep publishing new
Right.
work. So I spoke too soon, but he's not going to make a comment suddenly. That changes the whole dynamic. So Corey, I wondered if you could just talk through the schedule a little bit, in terms of what led you to these texts. I sort of bearing in mind that it was quite a while ago that you actually came up with this course, but
yeah, but no, this course is in a lot of ways kind of experimental. I mean, as you said at the beginning, I mean, obviously there's no even vague gesture at covering Lewis and Tolkien, as we're going to cover the both of them. This is not a survey course in any way. How this course was designed was to think in very specific terms. I wanted to compare and contrast Tolkien. So like basically the germ of the class was, people always talk about Lewis and Tolkien together, right? In fact, people kind of lump them together like they're a team. And in fact, one of the things that I see, which often makes me pretty uncomfortable, is that sometimes people they're trying to make an argument about Tolkien or about Lewis, and they'll quote the other one to support their argument. And I'm like, they weren't like that. I mean, yes, they were friends, but that does not mean they're the same person. So what I was trying to get at in this class is really be thinking in some very specific ways to try to get at the similarities and differences between them. So in order to do that, what I did was I chose not works that were themselves similar externally. So like for instance, I could have done, I mean, did you see the Wasp Club and Notion Club papers from Tolkien are in the class? I could have compared that with Out of the Silent Planet, right? Which is the natural sort of Lewis pairing, as like they did their toss up about space travel and time travel, and one did the one and one did the other. And so I could have compared those two projects that they undertook at similar times and for similar reasons, right? But I didn't want to do that. What I wanted to do instead was to look at particular kinds of creative projects or particular themes that were really important to both of them. Things that they shared in that way, and I wanted to compare those two things directly. So you'll see when you see the from the schedule, some of the pairings that I've done seem a little bit uneven. Right, like I'm taking the Lost Road of the Notion Club papers and I'm comparing that with Till We Have Faces, right, which is not very intuitive nor very equal. Till We Have Faces is the, I think the greatest work of nonfiction or a fiction that Lewis ever wrote, and I'm contrasting that with like a not even half finished work by Tolkien. That doesn't seem quite fair, right? But the reason I'm doing that is not because I think that these things are equivalent in some way, but because in those works, the two of them are undertaking a very similar kind of creative project. That is, they're taking an established myth and they're retelling it, right? They're taking and they're kind of reinvesting that retelling that myth and reinvesting it with new meaning. For Lewis, it's the Cupid and Psyche myth. Until We Have Faces. For Tolkien, it's the Atlantis myth. In the Lost Road and the Notion Club papers. So I compare and contrast The Hobbit and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. That one might seem like a more natural kind of pairing, but again, the point of the pairing is the project that they're undertaking, and in both of them, we have both of those works serving as a kind of move from the mundane world into the world of adventure, like how you encounter magic and fairy, and the way that they undertake the project of bringing readers, especially juvenile readers, into a fantasy world for the first time. And both of them are very, very sort of consciously undertaking that project in those works. I paired Smith of Wootton Major with The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, another very unequal pairing, because in both of those works are very interested in the crossing of boundaries, right, and the pushing of frontiers and the exploration of things that are beyond, the normal access to mortals, right? So how do they both approach that? What do they do? So my goal here in doing these things was to really begin to see the ways in which when we see them thinking about the same kinds of things, when we see them doing the same kinds of things, what are their similarities and what are their differences in their approach? And I was really, really pleased with this, with the class. I felt that, you know, sometimes, as I say, it was kind of experimental. It would have been much simpler to design this course in a much more kind of standard way. Like, let's, you know, read a bunch of Lewis's major works and a bunch of Tolkien's major works and talk about them, you know. And so this kind of an experimental structure was, you know, kind of a gamble, but it really worked out. I was extremely pleased at what I felt I learned over the course of the class, and we had some really wonderful discussions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's a fantastic list of texts as well. And it was some of what you were saying makes me think back to last term and Brenton Dickinson's course on C.S. Lewis and love, because, you know, he does quite a lot on friendship in that, and Lewis has a lot to say about friendship. If I remember rightly, in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, he talks about friendship as with Owen Barfield as kind of friendship in opposition, and someone who's read all the right books but come to all the wrong conclusions.
Exactly.
So, you know, that idea that kind of, oh, if you're friends, you're boss and buddies, you never disagree. That's not true for Lewis and Tolkien. It's not true for most of our friends. And so that those kind of points where they disagree are really interesting. I suppose the line "The Witch and the Wardrobe" also has the resurrection of Christ in it, which is also something that Tolkien was interested in, but did so in a different way.
Exactly.
With Gandalf and with others. So I think a lot of people do get very excited when they hear that C.S. Lewis, you know, the guy who wrote Narnia and the guy who wrote Lord of the Rings, were friends, and it sort of feels like a kind of Marvel cinematic universe crossover where you see Iron Man and Captain America talking to each other.
Right.
But the reality is it's not quite that simple. That I mean, Tolkien famously didn't like the Chronicles of Narnia as well. I don't know if how much we know about that or how much you go into that, but just looking at the text themselves, you can see those areas of contrast, I suppose.
Yeah. No, it was, I mean, and I want to, you know, spoil my overall conclusions for the class, but you know, I definitely felt that I emerged with the understanding that I emerged with was really beginning for the first time really to be able to put my finger on the fundamental differences between the two of them. And people who, well, sometimes people who are fans of both don't see it as clearly. People who are fans of one and not the other see it much more clearly that the two of them just think very differently. I mean, they yes, they were friends. Yes, they shared many interests. Yes, they as you say, they read the same books, but they drew many of different conclusions. But that wasn't in the end the main thing I found that I got at. That is, it wasn't about the substantive differences in what they thought and what they said. It's the difference of how they approach. Like they think very differently. Their minds work very differently, and that is what I felt more than anything else. This approach of looking at them undertaking the same things and how they go about doing it and what they say when they do, really kind of helped me to understand them as thinkers, and you know, the contrast between them as thinkers and writers more generally understood, rather than like the specific topical differences between their approach. So anyway, it was a fascinating course in this way. I definitely you know, when I look back at the Signum courses that I have taught, this course is still definitely one of the ones that I'm most pleased with in retrospect.
And Liam, what are your thoughts on this? Corys talked about what he learnt from giving the lecture series. Have you taken something out of it that's slightly different to that, or were you sort of broadly in the same?
Well, yeah, I think one thing that you were talking about that I was remembering as I was looking over my notes from having taught this in years past is the surprising number of people who are fans of one but not the other coming into this class, having just very, very radically different outlooks and very different sense of like what, and of course we all know that they were friends and we all know that they worked together and commented on each other's stuff. But just two very, very, between two people who might on paper, you might expect them to look somewhat similar, two very, very different outlooks and approaches to similar questions and issues, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, they had a famous falling out. You see, this is the thing that I go back and forth with Lewis and Tolkien when I'm in my own thinking. Sometimes I wake up one day and I think, oh yeah, no, they were good friends and they were good influences on each other. And sometimes I think it's been way blown out of proportion and it's been romanticized because we want to put them together. And actually, they weren't that big influences on each other, and the fact that they both wrote fantasy is a lot more to do with who they read. But I go back and forth on that. I mean, it sounds like the course grapples with this question, but I don't know if you, either yourself or Corey, have a kind of feeling one way or the other of how important they were to each other in their own lives, or maybe that's not even the right question to ask.
Well, yeah, I mean, how important they were to each other. I do think that, so coming to, like, as somebody who's always been a big fan of both, I know that, I mean, from my childhood, because I first learned it, and I remember, Gabriel, you were exactly right. It was very much a kind of Avengers Unite attitude. That's a perfect metaphor for it. The feeling, it's incredibly romantic. The idea that my two favorite authors were like best friends, and I want them to be best friends. I remember the first time I read Surprised by Joy, which you mentioned, and he talks about and so when he introduces Barfield, right, and he talks about, like, his closest friend, and then there's another time where he talks about, like, this person who meant so much to him when he was, and I'm like, okay, and it's gonna be Tolkien, right? But it wasn't. It was Barfield. And then, okay, this next one, it's gonna be Tolkien. No, it was Hugo Dyson. And he does mention Tolkien, but he gets a comparatively small mention. Like, it seems pretty clear that like, the two of them were not, best friends. Like, they were friends. Like, and I think in some ways, one of the things that we can see from, for instance, evidence of things like the commentary on the Lay of Leithian by C.S. Lewis, right? It is pretty clear that there was a kind of harmony between them that there wasn't, like, C.S. Lewis and Barfield did not have the same kind of literary impact on each other. Like, they weren't kindred spirits in the sense that they were both undertaken. That Barfield was in a totally different place, right? He wasn't a Don, right? He wasn't a fiction writer in the same way, right? I mean, whereas Tolkien, to Lewis, is somebody else who is doing exactly the kind of stuff that he really liked and that he admired. Even though, like, the Silmarillion stuff and Tolkien's larger, like, mythology development and stuff is not something that Lewis did. Lewis was not anything like the sub-creator that Tolkien was. But still, there was, I think, closer sympathy between them on their literary, their sort of their literary tastes and their literary undertakings. But that doesn't mean that personally, Tolkien was Lewis's most important friend. I don't think he was. I wonder if Lewis was more to Tolkien than Tolkien was to Lewis, because certainly one fairly clear impression that I get is that Tolkien was, at least in his adult life, doesn't seem to have been in his college life, but in his adult life, he appears to be a little bit more introverted than Lewis. I mean, Lewis was the social epicenter of, everything that was going on, hosting everything in his chambers and everything, and Tolkien seemed to be a little bit more on the outskirts of like the Inklings, certainly than Lewis. And so I wonder if in Tolkien's list of friends, Lewis would have ranked higher to Tolkien than Tolkien would have ranked to Lewis, just because Lewis had more central friends. And I think partly that just has a lot to do with Tolkien having a family life. I mean, he had friends on the side, whereas Lewis's friends were the center of his life, as he was in his Bachelor Dawn days there.
And Liam, is that to your sense as well?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking, Corey, as you were saying all that, famously people talk about the debt that Lord of the Rings owes to Lewis, that if it weren't for his continual prodding
Right.
and instigating and really and pushing Tolkien that we might never have gotten the Lord of the Rings. Tolkien famously like to ruminate, like to expand, but in terms of actually getting it done,
Right.
it was a great debt of gratitude to Lewis actually, being his taskmaster on that. Lewis did not need Tolkien to get things done. Lewis cranking out, work after work. And it's sort of and this is going to sound very flippant, but the I did it, I like it, it's good philosophy, not a great reviser, Lewis famously, whereas Tolkien just endless revisions. Yeah. There's a sort of very much John and Paul thing going on there that the success of the Beatles is the tension between the two of them. I think the success of both of them to some extent, but certainly Tolkien, the tension between those two impulses, ways of thinking.
Speaking of creative tension, Sparrow, I saw you pop a book up for a second. It was Bandersnatch by Diana Glyer. So just explain what that means.
Diana Glyer released this book earlier in 2019, and she, as an Inkling scholar, has taken what she knows about their interactions, their mutual influence, who's the poker, who's the encourager, who's the resonator who really gets you, and turned the model of their interaction into lessons for writers, and specifically for writing groups. If she can observe these historical writers interacting and extract some facts, extract some patterns, and then encourage us as modern writers to find the person who's your Lewis, if you're a reviser 4,000 times. And it's brilliant, and I'm using it as writer space for a model of how writers can think of each other as colleagues.
Yeah, it's a terrific book, and the sort of more academic version of that book as well is also available. What's it called? Company They Keep. Yeah.
The Company They Keep.
Well, Chris has a comment about the Lewis and Tolkien course. She says, the way Dr. Olson paired works by Lewis and Tolkien made me think of the works in different ways and led me to write a recent Mythlaw article on Lewis, Tolkien, and Philip Pullman's Voyage tales, looking at Dawn Treader, Reverendum, and La Belle Sauvage. And so that article is available now in Mythlaw. It's a fantastic article, and it is free to download, I believe. So do check that out. And it's a great example of the influence of the course, but also, scholar Chris Swank sort of continuing to sort of push this idea of Lewis and Tolkien together, but also sprinkling in a bit of Philip Pullman as well, just to make it even more interesting. So that's fantastic to hear. I do highly recommend that article. I think we could talk about Lewis and Tolkien all day, but I mean, this is just one of the courses on offer at Signum this term. So I'd love to move on to classical myths and legends, because this is a really exciting course as well. It's brand new. It's going to be live. Larry is lecturing on this and precepting on this. Larry, tell us about the course.
That's a good question. So yeah, of course, in part is kind of in a response to the Germanic myths and legends that Nelson and Paul offered, which I think is fantastic, right? That's one of the great things about Signum, is that Germanic philology, Germanic myths and legends, sagas, all of that is kind of front and center for us, and I love that about what we do here. But I thought that, even when we get to the Germanic stuff being written down in the Middle Ages, the people who are writing it down have been reading the material, or at least some of the material that we're covering in the classical myths and legends course. And so, for me, when we're looking at Till We Have Faces, for example, in the Lewis and Tolkien course, my understanding and appreciation of that, and I think that Corey is absolutely right. That is absolutely far and away the best thing that Lewis wrote in terms of fiction. But knowing the Cupid and Psyche myth from all its permutations in the classical period that Lewis is drawing on, really enriches the story for me, and that goes to Shakespeare as well. I don't think you can really understand more than half of Shakespeare's references unless you have some idea about classical myth and what's going on there, because that's what he was reading, and that's what some of his sources, including Pyramus and Thisbe from Ovid's Metamorphoses, for example. So that was kind of my idea for this course, is to kind of help us, since we're talking about Proto-Indo-European cultures and languages, that this is another aspect of that we can put into comparative linguistics and comparative mythology and all of that, and just kind of really help our readings and our studies of these materials.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's an incredibly important space to fill. And you were saying earlier before we began, it's sort of surprising that we haven't filled this space yet. Although we've sort of touched on it.
I'm really happy because it gives me the opportunity.
Absolutely. To touch on it slightly with perhaps with Professor Faith Acker's class on the English epic, which sort of
right.
Really...
There's actually. I was looking at that while we were talking earlier, and there's actually very little overlap between this course and that course. I think the Aeneid is the only thing that, and some of Ovid are the only things that really overlap. Right. The rest of what they covered in that English epic course were things like Milton, the Fairy Queen, which thank God I don't want to ever teach the Fairy Queen if I don't have to. Fans of the Fairy Queen.
I mean, this is pure myth.
Come on now.
Well, I appreciate Spencer's poetry. I mean, the artistry that goes into that, and the invention of his own wonderful English meters. I hate teaching the Fairy Queen.
It's
and I apologize for that. I feel a little ashamed about not liking the Fairy Queen. But what's his sonnet sequence? That's usually what I choose to teach of Spencer. Is
the Amoretti? The
Amoretti. Written to his soon-to-be wife, or at least that's what we think.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway.
Sorry,
Faith in the English epic class covered the Fairy Queen and covered Milton, and I think there was some
as well.
Very little overlap.
Yeah. Gnomes pointed out that there was also Metamorphosis, but none of the Greek material. Gnome says so. Yeah, so it's the only thing I think that sort of touches on some of those sort of authors in those times. But as you say, the material is very different. This is pure myth, really, isn't it? Or well, I don't know. Would you say that? Whatever pure myth is, I realize I've said that.
Whatever pure myth is, right? Hence the legends part.
Right. Exactly. It's myths and legends. I mean, I'm reminded of the beginning of the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings. When Galadriel says something like story became myth and myth became legend and legend became plot, and it's like this kind of hierarchy, and it makes it sound like myth and legends are quite distinct. How are you using those two terms? Are they one and the same, or is there differences?
Yes. How's that? From my point of view, these things, out at the edges, you can say, okay, that's a legend, that's a folk tale, that's a fairy tale, that's a myth.
Right.
But what you're starting to really get in the middle. There's a lot of overlap, and the borders kind of are a bit messy. You really can't say, okay, the Odyssey is this. Well, we know it's an epic, but there's a lot of mythology in there. There's legend in there. I mean, in this one work, we've got multiple genres, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and history as well.
So the borders are kind of squishy and very porous.
Well, that sounds like fascinating sort of areas to explore and to grapple with. The other question I had for you, which you've sort of answered, but I'd be curious to hear a bit more, which is a question about your background, because when I introduced you, I talked about your sort of background in Old English and medieval literature. From what you're saying about this course, this is in a way looking at what later influenced medieval and Renaissance writers. But I'm just curious about how your own background fits in with this. Where did were you interested in this kind of stuff from an early age? Is this a kind of dual interest, or is this a way of you understanding later text through earlier texts? How does that work?
Boy, that's a good question. So way back, far distant youth, I originally was going to be a biblical scholar. And so I was doing some work in terms of fitting particularly early Christianity, but also early rabbinic studies and fitting them into a Greco-Roman context. So I was looking at cross-pollination between Greco-Roman religions and myth and the Christian myth and the Jewish national myth or ethnographic myth, and doing some work with that. And then I thought I was going to be a classicist, and then there was a life got in the way, and then 15 years later when I went to get my MA, my interest had shifted a bit, and so I became a medievalist. But I still have the interest in classical materials and the survival of classical materials into the Middle Ages, and the influence they have there. So one of the things that isn't in my Signum biography is I work with the sources of Anglo-Saxon literary culture, and one of the things that we look at is how the medieval scribe copied these classical texts and read these classical texts and possible influence of these classical texts on medieval literature and language.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool.
So
that makes sense.
Yeah. I want to do all the things.
But you sort of mentioned sort of being interested in this from an early age, because so many people come across these myths and legends as children. For me, it was through the work of Asterix. And things like that. I don't know. I mean, it's very difficult to remember exactly where, but I was sort of always aware of people like Hercules and the Trojan horse and so on. For my father, I mean, he talked to me about this recently. It was he came to all of this through the work of Roger Lancelin Green, who was a great influence on both, on C.S. Lewis certainly, but to a lesser extent on Tolkien, just to bring it back to Lewis and Tolkien. I'd be curious to hear from the rest of the panel and also the audience. Did you also come across these myths and legends as a child, and can you remember what actually led you to these fascinating stories? I don't know if anyone wants to just jump in.
We get the cleaned up versions as kids, right?
Yes, right. Versions, yeah.
So, for example, when we read the Theogony, there's some stuff in there that you didn't run into.
It's all about cutting balls off and throwing them into the ocean and
yes, exactly, and the incest and all those kinds of things kind of get a little cleaned up in the kids' versions.
And certainly in the Roger Lancelin Green version as well. Sparrow, you've had your hand up. Do you want to talk?
I was going to say, I know you're saving the question for the end of which course I would want to take. And for me, it's the classical myths and legends, because my dad, like your dad, Larry, gave me kids' versions, but really beautifully written, beautifully illustrated Greek and Roman and Norse myths. They were his books when he was a boy. Mm-hmm. And so not only was it from my dad to me, but it was from these amazing old things to me. And boy, would I love to go through these stories as a grown-up. Wouldn't that be fun?
Yeah, it's something we all feel we know, but actually, have we really read these texts? I'm just looking at the texts here. I mean, I've done some of this stuff, but there's a lot that I really would be fascinating just to read properly and sort of spend time with. So it looks like a terrific course, and such an important.
I have to say that I've significantly changed the schedule there. So
okay, well, I put planned schedule up because I know how in live courses that's the magic of the live course, is that it can move around even when the course is happening. It's a terribly exciting thing taking a live course if you haven't done so already. Because you get to attend the lectures live if you want to. You get to ask questions, as the lecture is actually happening, and then you never quite know what's going to happen with the schedule. It could change even during the course as well. which is really cool and fun. And Noam says, I reread last year the book that introduced me to the classical myths. So I'd love to know what that book was, if you could let us know.
Yeah, no kidding.
But cool that you reread it. And I wonder if it sort of, was as you remembered as well. And Takako says, I haven't read very many classical myths and legends. And we should point out, Takako, you're based in Japan, so classical in Britain and America means Greek and Roman, but I mean, it's a particularly kind of Eurocentric view of the world. But Takako says, I read fairy tales more in my childhood. We had a few manga versions of ancient Greek and Roman myths and legends. So that sounds fascinating. I'd love to see a manga version of Hercules or whatever, or the Iliad. Oh gosh, I remember. I've just remembered the thing that introduced me to this whole thing, which was brilliant book. It was called, what was it called? Something like Crafty Odysseus or something like that. And it was read by Baldric from Blackadder, Sir Terry Thingamabob. And I think it was written by Terry Deary. And it was just so brilliant, and it was really gory as well. I remember that we listened to it in an audiobook. Anyway, so that's just come back to me. What else? Phil suggests we do Asterix for the Mythgard Academy. What do you think? What do you think, Corey?
I think it's a great idea.
And Noam says it was in Hebrew. The title translates to something like the magnificent flying horse. So just on the topic of the book that introduced you to all this stuff. But I don't know whose flying horse that was. I suppose Mars has
Pegasus.
Yeah. Presumably.
Who has the flying horse? Oh, sorry, I keep on talking over you. Well, Odysseus?
Oh, I just said Pegasus, and that would be
Pegasus.
the first.
Yeah, of course, Pegasus.
Flying horses.
Yeah, and Noam says, yeah, Pegasus. Yeah, okay. Okay, cool. Wow, well that sounds like a terrific course. Really looking forward to hearing how that goes. Me
too.
As I say, it's a really exciting thing to have a live course, and it's be great to sort of add this to the master's program, because it's a really important topic. So we have also Modern Fantasy 2 offered as a course. So this is not a live course, but it will be precepted live by Sparrow, and I think Sarah is also maybe precepting as well. But Sparrow, do you want to just talk about your relationship to this course, because and describe the lectures a bit, because I believe that the lectures are given by Corey, is that right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yes, the lectures were originally recorded by Corey, and I think in 2014. Is that about right?
Sounds right.
Sounds right. And the first thing people need to know is it's called Modern Fantasy 2, but it is not required to have Modern Fantasy 1 under your belt before you take it. Corey's approach to this course, as far as I can tell, and do not look at the man behind the curtain, right? So this is entirely, freewheeling, off the cuff genius as he goes strolling down the lane. The idea is to pull in 6 very different fantasy novels and hold them up side by side and say, okay, so what's fantasy? And the way that he close reads and then connects them to each other, you'll see from the schedule that the first half of the course, the first 3 books, are in entirely worlds that have some relationship to the world that I live in, and that I hope you live in too, because that'll make it easier. Catherine Kerr's Dagger Spell has a lot of Celtic, particularly Welsh influence, and Hard Magic takes place in a parallel Europe and America and Japan had World War I's antecedents gone very differently because of all the magic.
Mm-hmm.
Those, and in the second half, there are completely self-contained worlds of fantasy. Wow. And
Okay.
they're very different methods of creating a fantasy world, and we hold them up side by side and say, what are the different ways to do this? It's very exciting. Corey,
Interesting.
is that just sort of rolled off your tongue one morning at breakfast? You said, I shall create an entire brilliant course on this premise. Is that about right?
Yeah, no, I mean it was you know, the really, I mean, the modern fantasy courses 1 and 2, and as you say, they're totally non-sequential. It's just you know, I mean, in the very simplest terms, like Modern Fantasy 1 was like a bunch of really good Modern Fantasy books, and then Modern Fantasy 2 was like a bunch more other really good Modern Fantasy books. So they're not, they don't build on each other at all. But the but yeah, I mean, essentially, I wanted to be looking at not a survey course in the sense of, like, you know, covering a like a, you know, a particular topic or group of material from one end to the next, but looking at several examples of, like, what does the modern fantasy genre do, you know? And so yeah, so Sparrow's exactly right that you know, I chose these along exactly those lines, that I wanted to look at some examples of works which are kind of interacting really closely with our world, and asking some what if questions about our world, and others which are more acts of pure subcreation. So, and there's some variety. It's not a huge amount of variety date wise, but there's some. There are 3 which are older. In fact, like, ironically, 3 from 1986. 1986 was the great year of this course. 3 of the books are from 86, but then the others are all from the 2000s. So we've got, you know, 3 which are quite recent, and then 3 which are slightly older. So thinking about some of the ways in which the genre is moving, though goodness knows the genre is so vague, you know, it's so broad that I'm not trying to pretend there's any clear, you know, direction or trend in the genre as a whole. But yeah, I mean, for me, in large part, the modern fantasy classes were at root just a way for me to be thinking about what is fantasy? What does this mean? You know, especially since I think the initial challenge that led me to do the modern fantasy course was hearing people say, and even saying myself many times, about how, you know, we're doing a lot of Tolkien, and both saying and hearing people say how, you know, Tolkien is the you know, the father of the modern fantasy genre and stuff. And I was like, well, okay, so, like, let's look at the children and, you know, let's, like, actually see. And so, you know, of course, the first text is on fairy stories, which I mostly do for vocabulary, because I have a really hard time talking about, you know, fantasy as a genre and sort of the thing without using you know, Tolkien's vocabulary from on fairy stories. So I this was in that period when everyone was teasing me that, like, on fairy stories was on every syllabus that I offered. But that's why, because I mean, I don't want to take it for granted. I don't want to just use the vocabulary without people being familiar with it. But I found it just impossible. I mean, I already accidentally did it by using the word subcreation the way that I did, and so anyway, so that's why that kind of begins there, and then moving forward.
I mean, looking at the schedule reminded me of a quotation from Sir Terry Pratchett, in which he says, J.R.R. Tolkien appears in the fantasy universe in the same way that Mount Fuji appears in old Japanese prints, sometimes small in the distance, and sometimes big and close to, and sometimes not there at all, and that's because the artist is standing on Mount Fuji. But I actually wanted to throw that out there as to whether you agree with that, because I think, you know, it sounds like that might be true, but then also perhaps, is that a bit limiting? Is that, you know, can we can read Ursula Le Guin and not just sort of as a kind of, you know, with something with Tolkien in the context? I mean, we can read her as her own writer, and we can read, you know, Catherine Kerr and so on as their own writers, can't we? Or can we?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I don't think that it's about, you know, So some people will say that, like, you know, a lot of modern fantasy writers, like, yeah, I've heard people joke that like almost all modern fantasy writers begin by being derivative of Tolkien, and then they find their way, you know, after that. And that's, I mean, certainly you can find examples of such things, but I certainly don't think that that's the case. And Le Guin, of course, is a brilliant example. You know, I just finished doing A Wizard of Earthsea, which was in Modern Fantasy 1. I just finished doing it again years later in the Mythgard Academy series in November and December this past year. And and one of the things I was really struck by teaching through it again just in the last few months was what an amazing book that is for such an early book. You know, I mean, like, you know, other fantasy writers could like wish to have such a new approach and such gorgeous prose in their like most mature works, you know. And then here's Ursula Le Guin. It's, you know, it's the very beginning, and she's already, you know, in full form like that. It's amazing. But anyway, so yeah, so Le Guin, you can't read A Wizard of Earthsea and be like, yeah, well, clearly here she's still in her ripping off Tolkien phase and then moving forward. I think so. In one way of understanding Tolkien's influence, I think, on the fantasy genre. Well, let me offer a parallel. Dante and the Divine Comedy, right? I would offer as a parallel in the sense that what Dante did, one of the hugely important things that Dante did was establish vernacular literature as a legitimate thing, right? You know, he was one of the first people to say, I am going to write a great work, you know, not just like pulp fiction, but a great work, and I'm going to do it in the vernacular, right? I'm going to do it in Italian, and I don't care. Like, you think it can't be done, you think that only like Latin is like, you know, is sort of worthy for, you know, great works, and other people followed in his footsteps, like Chaucer, very deliberately, for instance. You know, when Chaucer was really kind of setting out to do, in a sense, for English, he did not think nearly as highly of himself as Dante, but then again, who did? But anyway, he was not nearly so arrogant as Dante in setting out to change the world. But I do think that he was modeling himself in part after Dante. So Dante changed the world of literature in Europe because he was the first one to show that, like, your own native language, even though it's, you know, it does not have the credentials, you know, of Latin from a philosophical, intellectual, and literary standpoint, you can still use that as an instrument for great creativity. And so in some ways I see that's the parallel that I see with Tolkien. It isn't that everyone is like inspired directly by his work. It isn't that all modern fantasy writers are modeling themselves after him, or that their stories are influenced by his stories very directly. Often you can see that, but I don't think that that's the most important thing. Just like Dante showed that you can write great stories in the vernacular and thus open the door for other people to write great stories in the vernacular, so Tolkien showed that, you know, fantasy literature is something that is inspiring and wonderful for grown-ups in the modern world, and that this is something that not that there is a market for. Again, it's not about the markets, right? It's about it's about the readers. It's about the inspiration. This is still a thing that can be done and that we should do. So even people like Le Guin, whose early work does not show, you know, derivativeness of Tolkien, is still clearly following in Tolkien's footsteps in that way, just as Chaucer was following in Dante's footsteps by saying, hey, I'm gonna write all of my work in English, which was a crazy thing to do in the 14th century. And it would have been completely ridiculous. Like, nobody would have given him the time of day had it not been for Dante, right? Because people weren't sure it could be done in English. I mean, maybe in Italian, but I'm not sure in English. But at least they had a precedent for this kind of thing, right? They knew that it was a legitimate thing. And Tolkien clearly provided the same thing for modern fantasists. Like, this is clearly an important, a legitimate undertaking, and something that it's okay to do. And so just as that for me, that's the biggest thing in really the most framing relationship that Tolkien has with modern fantasy, and the way in which he is the foundation on which everything is built in that way.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Just before we move on from thinking about this course, I just wanted to note and question. Note that actually all the courses we've talked about this morning have quite different structures and schedules, and you see that range across Signum. Sometimes there are kind of these survey courses where you really do a different text every week. This one is slightly different in that the texts are extremely long, but you have the time to fully explore them and to go through. You don't have to sort of read 500 pages in 1 week kind of thing.
Right.
So it's interesting, isn't it, that there is this kind of difference, and students have the ability to pick a course that has a different kind of approach. And this is actually also different to your other course, Corey, Lewis and Tolkien.
Yes.
Yeah. So was this a bit more of was this an experiment as well in terms of the scheduling?
Well, it was. This was less purely experimental because I was following the model of Modern Fantasy 1, but there it was. That one was more experimental. So for this one, I had the benefit of knowing that it had worked once and hopefully would again. But yeah, I mean, the experiment about this class, in a sense, or about the Modern Fantasy classes together, was not having a dominant theme. Like, in a sense, pulling together, they're not, I mean, as Sparrow was pointing out, they're not completely random choices. I haven't just, selected modern fantasy novels out of a hat and put them in this class. And yet I have there's no overall plan, about the tracing themes that develop from one work to another, doing close, it's the connections were much more broad among them. So it is much more like, let's just, it will be, the premise, it will be interesting and edifying to read like 6 very different examples of approaches to fantasy in the modern world and to think about those. And let's hope that happens. And it did both times. It was really fun both times. But yeah, whereas like in Lewis and Tolkien, the 3 courses we've talked about so far, I think, are all really interesting examples of some very different approaches to kind of putting together courses, right? We have, in Lewis and Tolkien, there was this very specific thing we were looking for. Like, let's look at what the attitudes of these writers are in these very specific circumstances. In the classical course, we have more of a desire for coverage, right? To look at the major things and make sure that we're, to give people the chance to really explore this tradition. Obviously, it's still hard to get in, Larry. I know all the things that you would want to get in, right? I mean, it's really challenging still, but still there's a design and a desire to have some coverage there. And then this one is again not quite random examples of a broad genre, right? And sort of inviting us to think really broadly about that. So yeah, there's definitely some interesting contrasts there.
And that's a great segue actually into our 4th and final course to discuss in this session. Although we won't be able to spend quite so much time on it because the Paul Peterson, who is teaching this course, isn't able to join us for this session. He has another commitment, and Nelson Goering, who's also helped putting this course together, also couldn't make it. But we definitely don't want to anyone to forget about this excellent course, Intro to Germanic Philology 2. Now, this is a sequel course like Modern Fantasy 2, but unlike Modern Fantasy 2, I understand that there is a requirement that you've done Germanic Philology 1, which was offered last term, because it's so kind of dependent on linguistic knowledge, I suppose. So it's a slightly different thing, and we can't sort of sell it to you in quite the same way that we can sell the other courses, because
Those
if
who
you signed
qualified
up.
to take it already know the kind of thing it's about.
Exactly. But we definitely want to think about it and sort of think about how awesome it is, because it's got such a fantastic schedule. And so it looks so fascinating. I mean, my understanding is that it's, the whole idea of philology is that it's languages in context, and you look at the whole package, and you kind of have to look at the whole package when you're thinking about like these kinds of languages. I mean, Old English, Old Norse, you can't pick up the context like you can for modern French, where you just sort of listen to a podcast or watch French TV. You have to sort of study that context in order to understand the languages. That's my understanding anyway. The panel, you have probably more expertise in this area. I don't know if anyone is able to talk about this. Does anyone have linguistic experience? Because I definitely don't.
Larry does.
Larry,
I do.
Fantastic. Can you tell us what your experience is, and sort of any thoughts you have on kind of philology in general?
Wow, what a question. My experience is that my undergraduate degree was religion, Greek, and linguistics. And over the years, I've done eight languages, most of them dead, but 8 languages. And I teach linguistics at another university. So I've had some experience doing that. I would love to teach this course, but it's taken better people than I.
And so is it true that if there is what we call a dead language, a language that's not sort of actively spoken in everyday life, when we're teaching that, we kind of have to talk about the context a bit? You can't just teach
as much as possible. Yes, right.
Yeah.
I mean, there are certain ones, take Old Saxon, for example, where we don't have as much context or as much literature as we would like to have. And so, what context we do have, that becomes even more important than, in Greek, where we've got this wealth of literature from several thousand years, from 1500 BCE to the present, where we've got this continuous tradition of this language. Right. So the context becomes a little less important because we've got this continuity. Whereas, in the case of like an Old Saxon or Gothic, what we can uncover of the context becomes very important. And of course, the connections with Proto-Germanic and Proto-Indo-European, those connections become very important.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm so grateful we've got the linguistic expertise in the faculty, because it's not my background at all, but it enriches my, I think it enriches the academic life of the university to have language alongside and equal to literature. And that's a very kind of, to take it back to Lewis and Tolkien, this is something they believed in as well and fought for in Oxford. You don't just do literature as if it doesn't exist in a language. Obviously, right. You've got to think about languages as well. And
let me put in a plug for our faculty too, because Paul, Nelson, and Carl, they know stuff. They are really very, very very and they're very good teachers.
They're leaders in the field. Yeah, and we're very lucky to have them. And this course is slightly, well, it's quite different actually to the other courses in terms of how it's taught, because it's 2 hours of preceptor sessions, 1 hour of lectures, rather than 2 hours, 3 hours of lectures and 1 hour of preceptor sessions as in other courses, because you do have to sort of spend time actually
doing
the
application. It's the application, right? Yeah. When you're studying language and linguistics, you got to get your fingers dirty, hands in there and work with it.
John is excited about the course because he asks, when will Germanic Philology 1 be offered again? I don't know if there's an answer to that. Sparrow or Corey, do you know?
There's a regular rotation that we offer them. It's offered at least once every 3 years, but we do have a regular cycle through the Germanic Philology courses, because we want to offer Philology 1 and 2, but we also, of course, want to be running regularly the Intro to Anglo-Saxon and the Intro to Old Norse, and the Beowulf translation seminar. Those are other ones that come around regularly. It's funny because people wouldn't get. So I bet you if we took these 4 courses and we, presented them to like a bunch of, just like sort of random people, and asked a poll question and said, of these 4 courses, which one is the one that was unilaterally demanded by students? Which one of these courses was produced in order to meet like adamant and vocal student request and need? And the answer is this one. Germanic Philology 2 is the one that students were clamoring for. The others have sort of come from the faculty, things that, we wanted to teach and things that we thought would be fun to do and would be really good topics to discover and discuss in our classes. Germanic Philology 2 there was public outcry, that we had we started experimenting with the philology classes through Tom Shippey's Tolkien through philology class. And, people really just wanted more, right? The Old Norse class came out of that because that was something people got a taste for and wanted more of. Allow us to continue, more advanced topics in Germanic philology. Having been introduced to the concept of and some of the basic principles of looking at the growth and change of the Germanic languages over time, there was still more to do, and they wanted to do more. So the people spoke, and eventually we were able to give them Germanic Philology 2, which they really wanted. So yes, within our students who are, we have a really strong interest in philology in our department. And I've often said, and I still believe it to be true, that Signum University is the only institution of higher education on planet Earth that has a growing philology department. They're shrinking everywhere else. I just heard this past week from a friend who teaches at a large school that they just cut their English department. The school just cut their English, history, visual and performing arts. Most of their humanities departments just got cut, actually, from the school entirely. That's well, I know it's not. Sadly, it's not a very extreme example in the modern climate, but it's but certainly Germanic philology as a study is decreasing, and you don't see many people hiring for Germanic philology professors anymore. But we do, like it's growing here, and that's awesome. It's really exciting. It's been an inspiring thing for me to see, even though, Gabriel, like you, I'm not a linguist myself, and that's never been my background, but I've been really excited to see that grow at Signum and to see us move forward with this. So in a lot of ways, Germanic Philology 2 was a really exciting course to see develop, because it's one of the plainest examples of like the organic growth of our curriculum and of our program of study.
Absolutely. Well, we're coming sadly to the end of our time, but we've got a few more minutes for some more questions, and I do want to also get to some of the comments that have been left across the session that I didn't get to read out. So firstly, Belle had a comment just saying that she really that they really liked the title of the idea of the book that you were talking about, Sparrow, which is Bandersnatch. Ultimately, Bell says, all the Inklings influenced each other in one way or another. I believe it is the complementary personalities of Lewis and Tolkien that make them an interesting pair. I think that's very true. And there was a few more comments about the legends, classical myths and legends course as well. So Noam had an update to reading the Hebrew version of the classical myths and legends. All the stories were shorter than I remembered them. They're only about a page per story. It's true that you can summarize these stories very succinctly, actually, and they expand in our imaginations, particularly when we're young. But I think one of the cool things about your course, Larry, is that you get to read the originals and you get to spend the time with them. Although actually, I mean, from my memory, Hesiod's Theogony was quite succinct as well.
It's a surprisingly short text.
Yeah. There's not kind of great sort of inner psychology or anything like that, sort of as you think through ideas. And Chris had a comment. Gareth Hinds has a series of graphic novels based on the Iliad, Odyssey, Beowulf, etc., very popular amongst my students at the community college level. That sounds very, very cool. Dakaka had a few comments about the Modern Fantasy II schedule, saying, I need to read David Eddings sometime and McCarthy. So yeah, I mean, I shouldn't. I feel embarrassed to admit this, but I haven't read any of those books on the Modern Fantasy II course. My reading of contemporary literature is actually pretty shoddy. I tend to read people who've been dead for at least 50 years.
So is mine.
Yeah. So I think. Oh yeah, Phil asks, what evidence is there that Zeus ever thought through anything? That's fair. That's fair. Takaiko comments, our philologists don't seem to sleep. Yeah, it's certainly very, very busy. And Takaiko also says more languages courses are coming, I believe. I don't know if that's a hopeful, I believe, or Takaiko, you have some inside knowledge there, but hopefully there we'll get some more in the future. And yeah, I think that's all the comments I missed. But that comment about what we were just talking about, filling in gaps in our knowledge, leads me to sort of a question we can end on, which is to everyone on the panel, if you could take one course this term, what would it be and why? And you can't pick your own. So I thought maybe, Sparrow, if we begin with you, what do you think?
I will say again, I would love to come back to the classical myths and legends as a grown-up, and because a few years, a parishioner of mine said, Sparrow, in her lovely southern accent, what is it you believe in? And I said, I had to think for a minute and said, I believe in stories. So
That's
that's my direction that I would come into that class from, Larry. And boy, I wish I were there.
It reminds me, I think there's a story of C.S. Lewis on one of the few trips he ever went outside the British Isles. He went to Greece for his honeymoon. And if I remember rightly, he came across some kind of shrine to Zeus or someone like that, and he said, in a way, I felt it wouldn't have been blasphemous to have prayed at that shrine, because he was sort of he saw the kind of link through storytelling between his own Christian beliefs and the kind of the classical stories and religion. So yeah, it's a kind of nice image. Sorry, who have we got left? Sorry, I've obscured. Oh yeah, Larry, what course would you take if you could take any?
That's a tough question, but I would probably go with modern fantasy too, since I really haven't read a lot of fantasy literature since 1986. So that was a good decade.
That's the year that everything happened.
I'd like to get back into reading more fantasy and science fiction than I've been able to, and so I would probably jump into that course.
Yeah, and there's some great influences of classical myths and legends on the genre as well, I suppose. I mean, thinking of Percy Jackson and certain things like that, but just in general. Corey, what about yourself?
Oh, definitely Larry's course. I'm really glad that we're doing that. I mean, in some ways, of course, it's a little bit different. That that we've been focusing so much on Germanic stuff. That's one of the things that I like about it. But I totally agree with Larry. It's the kind of thing where like these are myths that you need to know, because they are so deeply ingrained, even when they're not being alluded to, they're so deeply ingrained so if you're interested in medieval stuff and Renaissance stuff, as so many of our students are, you really need to know these things. And so I think it's just a wonderful opportunity to study through them. I would love to do it. There's some of these texts I haven't read in years, and I would really enjoy going through them again.
Fantastic. And Liam, what about you?
Well, I was probably going to say Germanic Philology too, but that's not actually, I'm not eligible for that, having not taken Germanic Philology 1. Germanic Philology 1 if it was on offer. But between the other two, I think I might, I'm going to go with modern fantasy. Actually, I don't know what fantasy literature is either, come to think of it, and I don't know that I would be 100% sure what it was at the end of that course, but I think I'd be have a much better idea. And some good ways to continue thinking about it.
We would have so much fun in class with Liam and Larry there.
Gosh, it's very difficult for me to answer that question as well, because it's like choosing between your children or something, especially since I have no skin in the game in this case. I'm not teaching any of these courses, but yeah, Germanic Philology I think would be definitely useful for me, but I could see getting a lot out of those other courses as well. So I agree with Takako. You know, ideally you'd be able to take all the courses at once, but and then that's not always possible. But that's my cop-out answer. I'll take them all and just not sleep for 3 months maybe. So thank you so much everyone for joining us. I hope everyone has a wonderful term. You know, it's great selection of courses, and the terms always go, I think, very well, and the students get a lot out of everything, and the teachers get a lot out of the students as well. It's a very, you know, two-way relationship. So I'm very much looking forward to it. I hope you are as well. I mean, how does the panel feel about the upcoming term? Are you excited?
I'm very excited.
Oh yeah.
Fantastic.
And a bit nervous too.
Well, it's the thrill of the live course. It's kind of nerve-wracking to begin with, but you get into the flow of it from my own experience, and then it's just so exciting to have a live course offered every term, if possible. So I'm really grateful that we're able to do that, and super grateful that we've got all these other courses as well. And thank you very much the rest of the panel for coming together and answering all these questions that I had and the audience had. And thank you to all of you for attending and asking questions as well. So that's it from me. Thank you again, and good luck with the oncoming term. And we'll see you at the next Signum Symposium event. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.